Okay, everybody, this is the first part of a few on specific accident investigation techniques, and we'll talk about how they relate to human performance investigations as well. And the first step in all of this is to discuss briefly causation. We're not going to go full metaphysical on this one, but you need to kind of have a certain manner of thinking in order to deploy these techniques and methods effectively. So first, when we look at causation, we ask, what is a cause and how do we know? So what does it mean to cause something? Like if we look at a beam dropping from a crane, or a reactor vessel head cracking, or Tesla autopilot determines that a puppy is less valuable than a mailbox. We need to know, how does causation play in those domains, and how do we come to understand causation in those spaces? We look at unintended consequences as well, right? There's the old chaos theory butterfly effect argument, as well as the comedic somebody slipping on a banana peel. So these are all different instances where there could be a multitude of related factors that led to something occurring. But again, how do we get to that point where we can say this is what caused this? So when we look at causal chains, it can be argued that all causes are and have been linked since the beginning of time. So, causes and causal chains do manifest in a time or temporal based structure. So, and as many things are interconnected, this isn't totally unlikely. But the question for us, right, is how far back do we go? And then we look at Zeno's paradox. So Zeno's paradox was from old ancient Greece philosopher Zeno. For somebody to travel, a distance, let's say 1 meter, they first have to go half that distance, which seems logical until you continue that chain, right? So then they have to go half of the half, half of the half of the half, and etc. And the argument was that because of that, because of the requirement steps of progression, it would, in theory, be impossible to ever go to ever travel any distance, right? Because you'll always have to be going some half. So for our purposes, there's 4 main types of causes, and you go ahead and pause this. I'm not going to go through each of these kind of verbatim, but it's important to be aware, right? So direct cause, this is just the immediate action, equipment failure, whatever that triggered the event. Then we have the apparent cause. This is the most probable cause of an event. And if corrected, so if that apparent cause is mitigated or fully eliminated, it will reduce the potential of recurrence to an acceptable level. We have root causes. This is the fundamental causal factor that, if corrected, will 100% prevent the recurrence of an event. And then you have a contributing cause. So this is an identified cause that would not by itself have caused the event, but directly increased the severity, lengthen the time to discovery, or in some way increase the probability of an event. Then we have a few more here. Physical cause. So this is the physical reason why something happened. Somebody slipped, the part was made of improper materials, and that's why it failed, etc. And then we have the human cause, right? This is where we start to break down the human actions that were a part of this. And then you also have latent cause. So we've talked before about latent error. So this is the causal version of that, right? The deficiencies in the management system or approaches or organizational structures that allow these errors or problems to continue or to persist. All right. So when we look at those last three, right, how did the incident occur? This is the physics and kind of the objective truths of the accident. Explains how the failure occurred. Does not necessarily explain why. Human cause, so what is the error that led to the physical cause, right? Someone did something wrong or did something which ended up wrong. And why did that happen? This could have been somebody, again, used the improper part, maybe perform maintenance incorrectly. Typically there's some human element because we do live in a kind of human-driven world. So that's a one we can dig into. And then latent causes, obviously this is when we look at management system weaknesses, training policies, procedures, etc., and how those can go wrong. So the first kind of method, but also way of thinking that we're going to cover is called a Y tree. Also could be called a Y chain, Y flow. There's anything, but if it's surrounding the question why, this is largely what we're talking about. So we have a problem, right? The cylinder doesn't operate smoothly. Why is it that the cylinder doesn't operate smoothly? Oh, the strainer was clogged. Okay, why was the strainer clogged? The oil was dirty. Why is the oil dirty? Dirt entered the tank. Well, why did the dirt enter the tank? The upper plate in the tank had a hole and a gap where the dirt entered. That's our physical cause. Then we have, why was there a hole and a gap in the tank? It was repair error during maintenance. There's our human cause. But why was there repair error? I mean, surely the humans know what they're supposed to be doing, right? And we have no procedure to follow. So that's our latent cause. Causal terminology overlap. So a lot of times there will be a lot of fuzzy, squishy boundaries between these things, right? You'll have contributing causes, seeming like latent causes, and etc. That's all right. Causation is intentionally messy. We're always doing kind of a hindsight is 2020 type activity. So you need to adhere to the proper guidelines for your application space. Remember to be aware of whatever the correct terminology is for your application. But for this, I just want you to understand the underlying principles of causation and what we're essentially saying when we determine a cause. Now, for our purposes, as we're looking at human performance, right, we have two critical components, an actor and an action. So the actor, someone or something taking action. For our purposes, this can be a thing. This can be a piece of equipment or something actuating, etc. An action. So this is something that affects the state of the world. Not in like a global, big kind of topic situation, but just our environment is affected by actions or by the presence of physical phenomena. So that is what we mean by action. And both are necessary for any cause you put forward, right? And then just as we've talked about, right, human error will always win. It's undefeated. We need to design for it and expect it. And no amount of training or procedures can remove it. Deals with an kind of system of infinite variables that are constantly shifting and dynamic. And as I've said before, right, when we're looking at especially like physical risk modeling and different things like that, it's important to realize the second we involve humans, right, the way I approach it with folks kind of from the more objective style engineering domains is, what would you do if the pump you have in your system model suddenly decided to be a valve that day? Sources of human error. So this would be kind of components of that human cause piece. So we have cognitive sources, right? Memory, attention, vigilance, decision making. Ergonomic ones, so like the example we've discussed before about the plane levers. Psychosocial, so this could be events like teaming, communication, some of these aspects there. And then organizational, this is where we have our management, etc. And remember, as all these concepts intertwine and kind of build on themselves, right? Organizational sources, we want to be aware, right? Those would be latent, but if we go back to recall reasons, resident pathogen analogy, the higher up in an organization, the higher in the hierarchy that someone sits, the more pathogens they create just by definition. So, kind of an important thing to be aware of there. And then it's important, we've talked about this, but just to remember, right, the things that humans are good at and the things that we're bad at. So we're intuitive grammarians, but not intuitive statisticians. We have the Dunning-Kruger effect. We're very bad at self-judgment. Future consequences. We're not very good at forecasting things into the future. We tend to discount negatives and overestimate positives and their likelihoods. Vigilance. So continual attention is one of the most difficult things for a brain to do. That comes from studies done by William James, kind of considered the father of psychology. And repeated precise actions. We are not good at that. Okay, so then pivoting, right, we look at like risk. So risk, and this is I'll show a more traditional example shortly, but this is an example of the risk hierarchy. It's always some graph, and it is severity combined with likelihood. So many risks can't be eliminated, but we can change the inputs. There's economic risk, safety risk, reputational risk, existential risk, and then political risk, as well as many others. You can imagine kind of different ways that might manifest there. This down here is a more traditional severity or impact versus likelihood one, but accident investigation, the way we do it, and especially with human performance, is a risk assessment in reverse. The cause of an accident is a risk that wasn't mitigated. So high severity and low likelihood does not mean impossible. So then we ask, right, especially from a human side, does that mean it's inevitable? And this is why it's important that we treat design as resilience and risk management and how we can change the inputs before a problem occurs. Yeah, traditional risk matrices will look kind of like this, and they'll have different, we have probabilities here, and then different types of impact. You'll have different measurements. Again, refer to whatever is relevant in your domain space. We look at risk perception. So how does our risk perception affect our beliefs? This is a big component to how we look at decision making, especially decision making under uncertainty and risk. Every single person has a different level of kind of innate or inherent risk tolerance. And it's important to remember, right, risk tolerance will differ from an individual versus a grouping or society, etc. We also tend to underestimate future risks, which align with our preconceived notion. For example, the theory that nuclear power is safe to me, right? Or inflation is very concerning to me. COVID vaccines are concerning, right? Where on the risk matrix does that fall? But what's important is that in all these decisions, right, we do bring our innate biases and assumptions with us. So it's important to remember kind of where that lives and to be able to be aware of it. It's not something you can get away from completely, but it's something we can mitigate with some kind of metacognitive steps. All right. Now, the first big method that we'll go into a little bit is task analysis. We've talked a little bit about this before, but This will be kind of more in depth for those things. So first, how do we do a task analysis? The question is, did we set up the task and user for success? So task analysis is a systematic process designed to evaluate how a task is performed, what does success look like, what are the feedbacks for success or failure, and what factors influence performance. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but there's also a lot of pros and cons. So when should we use task analysis? When task construction is critical to success and we're not sure where the error occurred within the task or where the risk of error is greatest. It's used to break a task into different subtasks, identifying what should have happened. It's also used to identify deficiencies in training procedures and procedure adherence. Different advantages of it: familiarizes the investigator with the task, helps to identify where problems occurred while performing the task, and can inform a lot of mitigations and corrective actions in a really precise way. Now, limitations or problems we have with task analysis is it's very time consuming and burdensome. Walkthrough task analysis is most effective if performed with the personnel normally responsible for the task, which may be difficult to arrange, especially if you're coming in after the fact to do an investigation. And they can be difficult to complete without first-hand experience, which can tend to lead to a high need of SME involvement. So what steps are required in task analysis? First, we define the scope of the task analysis. So the thing with the task analysis, you could really go forever in the task analysis. You can deconstruct actions seemingly forever. So you have to define the scope, set those boundaries so that you understand which task, conditions, procedures you're specifically looking at, so that you don't kind of lose the thread and end up either too in the weeds or not far enough. You then collect task data. This can be from observational studies of watching the task, doing interviews or talk or walkthroughs of the task. Typically, this will involve collecting data not just on the task's performance, but on circumstances of the task performance, so timing or success levels, etc. We then interpret the collected data, so that gives us hierarchies, lists, or tables depending on the methodology you're following. We then identify error or failure points. This is where we can see training failures, procedure issues very clearly. Okay, so as we look at different methods, different types of task analysis, there's 4 big ones. How do we represent the information here? We either have a hierarchical task analysis, a tabular task analysis, a link analysis. That one is less commonly used, but is still really relevant. And then an applied cognitive task analysis. And each one of these methods will have different scopes, different requirements, different levels of need, depending on what you're trying to do. Okay, so hierarchical task analysis is a top-down method. We begin with the overall goal and then break down into subtasks. The depth of how deep you go can vary. And it tends to not be very effective for when you have communication issues or issues that are external to the task or extra task. And here's just an example, of different goals and different ways that the hierarchy can manifest. Tabular task analysis. So this is a bottom-up method of task analysis. You begin with the subtask or basic action levels and you build up. It becomes incredibly detailed, captures cognitive steps in decision making well, and it also captures task support and communication levels. However, it can be very time consuming. So oftentimes it won't be the primary one that you'll start with, just because the level of specificity and precision can be really difficult and costly. Then you have link analysis. Oh, looks like my image here messed with this. Let me fix that. Okay, so an intermediary method lives between the tasks. So what we're doing here is we're focused on the links between the tasks. This provides a lot of information on communication steps, captures the interactions between processes and systems really well, and it's extremely useful for teaming situations, complex handoffs, or any instance of reliance. If we're looking at a sequence of actions or tasks where there's reliance on a specific thing occurring in a specific way. Oh, and this one's messed up too. Hold on. All right, so looking at applied cognitive task analysis. So this captures the specific cognitive demands of a task. So it'll capture information needs, cognitive demands and error traps will become immediately obvious, and cognitive supports like decision aids will be captured. Also, this can be helpful to understand kind of the nuances or qualitative nature of task performance, especially in instances where you have high demands or levels of cognitive load, as well as different interactions and things. It won't do as well at capturing the interactions as like a link analysis will, but what it will do is it'll capture the implications of those interactions. So especially when you are looking at notions like reliance or some of these specific ways and how those interactions can manifest and how they impact the overall kind of perception and performance of the individual. And that is the end of part 1. So in part 2, we're going to continue on with other techniques specifically. Thanks.